Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, where your voice is heard and opinion matters.
Welcome back indeed. In this segment, Bantwana Benkosi, we're going to be talking this matter of the budget. And I'm joined by the co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice, Neil Coleman. Thanks very much for joining us here on Power Talk and for creating time. How are you, Neil?
No, I'm good. Mbuyiseni, just to correct, I'm the senior policy specialist at the IEJ, no longer the co-director, but otherwise good.
But you are the founder.
Yeah, I'm a co-founder.
Okay. What does it mean that you're just no longer co-directing?
It just means I don't have to deal with all the management. Mbuyiseni.
Okay.
I can pronounce on the policy issues.
I see. All right. Very big claim that the National Treasury is manufacturing a fiscal crisis in a very accessible way. I mean, please explain to the listeners, particularly the idea that they actually initially didn't need the type of money, I think over 70 billion that they said it's a loophole in their budget. They actually needed much less. How do you arrive at this conclusion? And on what basis do you think they are manufacturing, that this is just the manufacturing of a crisis that is not there?
Yeah. Before I go into the figures, Mbuyiseni, I think it's important to just remind listeners that this is not the first time that Treasury has, as you said, manufactured a fiscal crisis in order to achieve certain objectives. You know, I think a lot of people think of what Treasury does on the budget as like a bookkeeping exercise where they balance the amount of revenue and the amount of expenditure. And of course, there is that element of it. But I think there's also an element of a clear sort of ideological and political agenda to push government and to push society in a particular direction because of their economic paradigm. So very often when they think that a direction is being taken that they don't agree with, they will use, if you like, scare tactics. Or blackmail the government and the public to say, listen, we're heading into a crisis and we've got to stop spending, for example. We've got to cut spending. We're borrowing too much. Now, there are, of course, big, fiscal challenges in the country. And, that is a function of bad macroeconomic management. It's a function of a lack of investment in society, a lack of pro-growth projects. So the low growth in the society, it does create major fiscal problems. But instead of digging us out of the hole, what they're doing is digging us deeper into the hole. Now, to be fair, Mbuyiseni, I think it's important to acknowledge that this year's budget that was presented in February was a significant improvement on previous austerity budgets that we've seen in recent years. And, there was a moderately improved investment in frontline services, in social grants, et cetera. And I don't think Treasury wanted to go in that direction. I think, in a sense, they've been pushed in that direction. And that their quid pro quo, or their sort of, their sort of what they got in return was to introduce the 2% VAT increase initially, which was then rejected, and then they came back with a 0.5 this year and the 0.5 next year. So, so what they've done now is to say in the court papers and publicly, listen, because you guys have forced us to drop the 0.5% VAT increase this year and next year, we're now facing this massive budget hole, or this revenue hole of about 75 billion rand. And they calculate that based on the 3 years, what they would have received from the 0.5 increase this year, and then an additional 0.5% VAT increase next year and the year after. But when you look at the figures, this is a complete distortion and misrepresentation of the facts in the following way. Firstly, there is no 75 billion rand shortfall this year. The amount of revenue they would have generated from the increase this year is 13.5 billion, according to their own figures, 13.5 billion. And then you've got to subtract from that the 2 billion which they were going to invest into additional zero rating. Remember, they were going to add to the zero rating. That would have cost 2 billion. So in fact, they would have only got 11.5 billion after that. Then, if you look at the fact that they have actually achieved an additional revenue since their initial projections, they've achieved an additional revenue of 8.8 billion rand. SARS has collected 8.8 billion rand more than they projected. By the way, this happens every year. They always underproject the amount of revenue that they are going to collect, and that also, results in them spending less than they are able to spend. So if you take that 13.5, remember, minus the 2 billion, and then you subtract the 8.8 billion, what do you get? You get a shortfall of 2.7 billion for this year. Now, just to put that into context for your listeners, 2.7 billion, might sound a lot of money, but we have a 2.6 trillion budget. 2.6 trillion.
It's about 1%?
It's 0.1%.
0.1%.
0.1%. Now, okay, so your listeners might say, and in my Twitter, in the Twitter debate, I've seen some other people saying, but this is a medium-term shortfall. Even if you look over the medium term,
even if it's 3 years, it doesn't come to 75 billion.
It doesn't come to 75 billion. It comes to what I've calculated, and I encourage your listeners to look out at my tweet in which I set it out in detail. But what it comes to is 59.7 billion shortfall over 3 years, which also sounds a lot. But if you take the 3-year budget of over 8 trillion, that is actually a shortfall of about 0.7%. So these are small numbers in Mbuyiseni, and for the minister and the Treasury to then go to court and to say that they're going to have to be large-scale budget cuts to deal with this shortfall is completely disingenuous, and is frankly just misleading the public and trying to, as we said, stampede government and the political parties into agreeing to large budget cuts. So obviously the question arises as to why Treasury is acting in this way, and that's what we've tried to explain.
There are at least two assumptions, and I'll return to the numbers, which I think over the years have not been sufficiently clear in the mind of the public. And I'd like you to sort of speak to them, because it seems to me that the first assumption relates to this unilateral power of National Treasury. Please locate for us where National Treasury lies in relation, firstly, to the National Executive, and then secondly, to the Minister.
Yeah.
And SARS.
And sorry?
And the South African Revenue Services.
Yeah. So, Treasury does have certain powers in terms of the Constitution, and perhaps, given this fiasco that has unfolded now and their conduct over the last 30 years, perhaps that's something that needs to be looked at. But the reality is that legally and technically and constitutionally speaking, government has complete power and Parliament have power to supervise and to determine national budgets and to amend and reject budgets which Treasury places before Parliament. With the exception of the VAT Act, and I must congratulate the EFF in particular on the positions that they've taken in Parliament and in court, that to challenge, together with the DA, this unilateral power which the minister has to simply announce a VAT increase without the agreement of Parliament. This is why we're sitting with this crisis now. So that, many argue, is unconstitutional. But apart from that power, Parliament has the total ability to amend and reject the budget. And government has, I was an advisor to a minister in 2009 and was part of, the various Director General's forums and so on. And government has processes where there's a long lead-up time towards the budget and the medium-term budget policy statement in October, as well as the budget in February. So there's plenty of opportunity for government to interrogate the budgets and to reject aspects that they don't approve of. And there's a ministerial committee on the budget, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that since 1994, Treasury has operated as a government within a government. It's operated as a super ministry. And I think this is what this crisis has put in sharp relief, this elephant in the room, which is Treasury that abuses this power. And it appears that government is afraid to confront Treasury. And you've got to look at the political economy of this. This isn't just because a ministry is powerful. It's part of the transition. It's part of the economic settlement, which has vested this power in this Treasury, which is seen as a sort of holy cow. And in a sense, you've got Treasury acting as a sort of on behalf of the so-called markets, acting on behalf of business to say this is acceptable, this is unacceptable, et cetera, et cetera. And for whatever reason, that power has never been seriously challenged until now. And I think this is what is also quite, while what is happening is quite disturbing, it's also quite promising to see that for the first time there's a serious debate in society and in Parliament about whether the types of macroeconomic posture which Treasury is advancing, the type of measures that they are proposing are acceptable or not. So this is a sort of, contestation which is going to need to see a complete revising of the way in which budgets operate.
They could argue that their initial proposal was 2%, and I suppose on that basis, the numbers of 75 billion make sense. And that they've had to then, because of being negotiated, go to 0.1%, 0.5% basis point. But on the base of the 2%, would you agree that they would have been able to sort of cover up what they identify or speak about as a fiscal hole of 75 billion?
Yeah, I mean, for listeners who are interested in the technical detail, you can go to the budget review from the 12th of March when they presented the second version of the budget. And in that, they compare what was in the initial budget on 19th February to the second budget that they proposed. And what they did was they already had reduced spending in various areas in the 12th of March budget. So, for example, you remember they gave above inflation increases to social grants in the first budget. There's still inflationary increases, but they reduced that by, for example, about 4.6 billion for 2025, and they changed non-interest expenditure by over 9 billion, and so on and so forth. So what they did was they adjusted the budget and they allowed for an increase, a slight increase in the level of debt, and so on and so forth. So there was a reduction in a significant reduction in revenue that was arrived at, but there was also a corresponding reduction in expenditure, and they achieved revenue through other means. So, there are ways in which these can be dealt with. But the most important thing in Mbuyiseni that I think is important to stress for listeners is that there are multiple proposals which have been put both by the Institute for Economic Justice as well as, political parties in Parliament. I saw the EFF put out a whole detailed proposal around revenue options, and many other political parties as well have put those to Treasury, and Treasury has refused to consider them at all. So there are revenue-raising options, and we can divide those into two.
You mean other than the VAT?
Other than the VAT, and there are two types of alternatives. The one is alternatives that can immediately in this year achieve the 13.5 billion that they were talking about, which, as I said to you, is more like 2.7 billion for this year, can immediately plug that hole. But we should also be talking about raising additional revenue to to meet, all the many requirements in terms of frontline services, employment of nurses and teachers and doctors and so on and so forth. So we actually need more revenue, not just the revenue that we would have achieved through that 0.5% increase. So the areas like, raising the corporate income tax rate back to 28%, removing tax breaks for high-income earners on pension and medical aid contributions, tapping this massive reserve account which sits in the Reserve Bank. All of these things can be achieved now. There's nothing stopping government from doing that. Some of the other measures, the second category is other measures which are more medium term, like a wealth tax or financial transaction tax and these sorts of things which require the legislation and the sort of financial architecture in order to introduce them. But those options are there. Treasury simply refuses to consider them.
Well, the implications then, Neil, of this late passing of the budget, we're looking at possibly June, if my calculation of the days for a fiscal framework to be passed are correct. But this has never happened. And, because people budget with financial certain time frames, what are the implications in your view, not just to this time frame, but maybe also to the fact that some outlets may have already put price tags in Pick and Pay, in Game, in Walmart and all of that. They've already put price tags for the goods that are going to be put on the shelves on the 1st of May, which have calculated in the 0.5% increase in the goods.
No, they're very quick to impose those additional taxes. They must be very quick to reverse them. I don't think there's an issue there. They must simply reverse them. On a broader question, it would be good if you could get a sort of legal expert to talk through all of the processes in relation to the Money Laws Amendment Bill and so on. But in essence, we don't have the same sort of challenge that you have in, for example, the United States, where people will have read about the fact that they have, when they don't approve the budget, you have a sort of the public service there grinds to a halt. In South Africa, you have, I think it was 4 months, I can't remember, possibly more, or rather, it's about 40% of the previous year's budget that can be spent to deal with any sort of delays. Because obviously Parliament anticipated that there could be the situation where a budget is amended, it's rejected, it's got to go back, etc. So the fact that it's never happened before doesn't mean that there is, now a crisis and that there's not the space to do it. I think the crisis is more about the mishandling by Treasury and the Finance Minister of a situation which they should have never confronted us with. In other words, the public and political parties made it very clear that they rejected a VAT increase. It didn't matter what the level of the VAT increase was, and therefore they had to find alternative approaches. But they dogmatically pursued that regardless. And you remember the Minister of Finance, even in the court case, was saying it's impossible to reverse this VAT increase. To the last minute, they were completely intransigent. So it's more a political and ideological posture, as I was saying, that they're pursuing.
So, Neil, final question. What interest really does the scare tactic, which you alluded to, speaking about a revenue hole that barely exists, what interest does it serve to produce such a crisis? In what way does business in South Africa, if National Treasury is acting in their interest, in what way are they benefiting from this miasma?
Yeah, there are always contradictions in these processes. There's a lot of analysts will say to you, capitalism is a contradictory system, and that these contradictions often manifest itself, but in a much more concrete sense. What you have here is a Treasury which still believes in what they call fiscal consolidation, but we also all understand it as austerity. What's very interesting is that a contradiction has actually emerged between what Treasury says and what the Minister of Finance says. You remember when he gave interviews after the first budget, which, as I said, was an improvement in previous budgets. He said, listen, we've been pursuing this austerity for years now in order to cut the debt, but it's completely failed. And the reason that it's failed is because we haven't promoted growth. We now have got to go for growth. Now, what he has articulated in that way, Treasury doesn't believe in. So they want to impose, reimpose.
You see, this is where I think maybe you want to patiently, because we're making this assumption that the minister is National Treasury. I don't think the public understands this dynamic, that there is actually an institution almost outside the sort of reigning power of the minister, called National Treasury, which is who drafts the budget. And that this institution, over the years, has managed to basically produce docile ministers of finance.
Exactly. You know, I think there's a...
It looks like we've just lost Neil there. It doesn't make sense. Okay, if you've just joined us, this is Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. We've lost contact with Neil Coleman, who is the director, he says now, senior researcher. I don't recall the actual title of the Institute for Economic Justice. And they are making a very, very curious and I think important argument. And for all of us in society, it's important to appreciate that this moment of crisis presents an opportunity for actual reforms in the ways in which a budget of a country is being made, is being constituted by National Treasury, Minister of Finance, and the rest of Parliament. We've got to change that, because the manner in which this budget has been used, composed, consolidated, has not really resulted in employment and growth, the problems that are chronic to South Africa's economy. Neil, are you back?
I'm back.
Yes, please. Yeah, I don't know what happened, but please feel free to conclude your point.
Yeah. So I heard the end of what you were saying, Mbuyiseni, that there's a need for a reconfiguration of the powers of Treasury, of the way in which the budget is overseen, and the way in which political parties in Parliament deal with that. And this is an irony about the government of national unity, because many said it's going to be, neoliberal in its economic orientation. But actually, it's opened up the contestation around the budget, and I think that is a very welcome development. And I hope the political parties in Parliament, as budget...
Neil, before just on the same thought, how do you reconcile that the DA is at the center of this shift when it is supposed to be the party of business and the markets?
Well, remember that their opposition to the VAT increase isn't, in fact, because of its effect on the poor, although they claim that that's the issue. They are in favor of massive expenditure cuts and the reduction of taxes. So it's completely consistent with their economic philosophy. But the reality is that because austerity has hit everybody so hard, in terms of cutbacks on health and education and policing and all of these things, that their constituency and the constituency of all political parties are extremely unhappy with the impact that this has had on their lives. The fact that social grants have not kept up with inflation, the fact that all these problems are a result of unnecessary, brutal cutbacks which have taken place in the last number of years. So these political parties are going to have to account to their constituencies and say, look, we supported X, Y, and Z because we believe in, either a developmental state investing, or we believe in a neoliberal type of economic framework. So the next period is going to be extremely interesting to see how political parties manage this transition into this new budget.
Neil Coleman of the Institute for Economic Justice, thanks very deeply for always creating time. It's always a pleasure to interact with you.
Many thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's 1100 hours here on Power Talk. Bantwana benkosi It's time for the news with Nhlanhla Sihume.